if you got into some legal trouble, if you really got jammed up legally, you wouldn't want to call me and ask my advice on what you should do. If I'm being honest with you, all I'm going to tell you to do is go ahead and get a hold of a good lawyer. I might even be able to recommend a lawyer, but I'm not going to be able to give you sound advice. And if I am not being honest, I might give you advice. But you would be foolish to take that advice. It would be on a whim. Because I don't have the credentials of a lawyer. I don't have the credentials. I don't know the law significantly enough to be able to give advice, to give counsel when it concerns the law. And so when we see a statement like we saw with Mark saying that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that he's co-eternal and co-equal, that he essentially is God incarnate, we have to stop right there and say, okay, well, that is a huge statement. It's a statement that requires faith, but we've already established that it doesn't call for blind faith. It doesn't call for gullibility. It calls for faith in the same way that all knowledge calls for faith. The same way that the first president of the United States was George Washington calls for faith. Okay, so we've already established that. But we need to investigate the credentials of Mark, because if Mark says that Jesus is God, and I say that Jesus is not God, we really have to examine which of us has more credentials. If I say that you should plead guilty, but your lawyer says that you should plead not guilty, based on our credentials, there is one person that you should place your faith in more than the other person. In this case, it would be obviously the lawyer. So let's see if Mark is more qualified to make this statement than I am, and on concerning who is Jesus. And we're going to do a whole video on who Jesus is in the near future. But for now, let's look at and examine Mark and see what his credentials are. So first of all, we have to understand that Mark is a real person. Mark is a real person, like you're a real person and I'm a real person. Sometimes we have a hard time thinking historically of people, even if it's from the 30s, right? Sometimes we think like, because all the footage in the 30s is in black and white, it just seems surreal. It almost is like those people lived in this world that was void of color, that it was only a world of black and white. And we realize that that's just our perspective, that those people were people like we're people. And the further back you go, sometimes there's just this great distance between their culture and their time period and everything else. And there's so very little we think to relate to that we almost don't think of them as people in the sense that we think of people today. But these were very much people. These are people with wants and desires and emotions. They were excited and they were depressed. They were anxious like we're anxious, and fearful like we're fearful, and all of a myriad of emotions that we go through. They were concerned with bills and how to pay bills and going to work, and they woke up tired, and I mean just everything that you and I go through. These people. So Mark is a real, actual person. His name was John Mark. John was his Jewish name, and Mark was more of his Roman name, so he was referred to in his time and life period as John Mark. In fact, the Bible refers to him as John Mark. That's how everybody would have known him. That's his name. He had a family. His dad was probably dead. Mary was his mother. And there's so many Marys and Simons in the Bible. We always get a distinguish when we're talking about Mary. They usually have to put a suffix on there to tell us which Mary are you talking about, which Simon are you talking about. But this was Mary, the mother of John Mark. And that's how we know his dad was probably dead, because you would have been known by who was your father, not who is your mother. But since ancient scripture, ancient writings identify Mary as the mother of John Mark, or John Mark the son of Mary, we can presume that the dad was most likely not around, or probably deceased. So he grew up in a single mother home. Mary's house was the scene of the Last Supper. It's where the disciples gathered at Pentecost. It is where they gathered to pray for Peter at her for Peter in Acts 12. Remember when Peter, and again, some of this you may or may not know, depending if you're a Christian who knows the Bible listening to this, or if you're somebody who isn't a Christian, you might not know. But Peter was arrested, and they gathered at Mary's house to pray, and a miracle took place. So Mark was in the thick of it. I say all that to tell you that like his house was central to some pretty key events that are historical. You could look these things up extra biblically. You can look these things up in things that have nothing to do with the Bible, or just historical documents to see that these things took place. And his house was central to a lot of these things. So he was very present. He was very around. He knew who Jesus Christ was. He was most likely a teenager at the death and during the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And if you have a problem with the resurrection, we're going to have a video concerning the resurrection in the near future as well. So he was around, man. He knew who he was. He wasn't, obviously, he was too young to be an actual follower. He wasn't with them like the apostles were with him, or his disciples were with him, but he got taken under his wing, under the wing of Peter. Peter was a key player, a direct disciple. He not only was a direct disciple, an apostle, one of the 12 that followed Christ through his 3.5-year ministry. He was the leader of the apostles. He was definitely a huge key player and knew Jesus Christ very, very intimately. Again, Peter being a real person, a real human being, we could do people studies on all of these people to gain and garnish lots of information, even outside of the Bible. These are historic, real people. He was the nephew of Barnabas. And so Barnabas again is another key person after the resurrection in the missionary work with Paul, and Paul is a real person. And there's recorded in the Bible this major failing of John Mark. John Mark tried to go out and be a missionary with some of these heavy hitters, and he couldn't hang, and he left back and really upset Paul. And Barnabas actually vouched for him and got him back involved in some of the missionary work later, where he was successful. So we see even in John Mark's life, we see successes and failures. We see him fail, not do well. I mean, it's not a story of bravado. It's a story of complete human failure and some of the conflict that goes along with failure sometimes, some of the conflicting personalities that were involved in all of that. So I mean, we have to conclude that Mark is in a position to say who Jesus Christ is. Now, you and I can disagree with Mark, but we have to understand at this point, we are disagreeing with somebody who has more credentials than we do, is in a position to tell us who Jesus Christ is way more than we're in a position to. And we also have to remember that it isn't just this one guy, John Mark. We've only decided to take a look at this one guy, but we can do the same thing with all of the gospel writers and all of the players, all of the people in the Bible. We can trace them back and see that they're real people who knew Jesus well, or were around and with people who knew Jesus very well. And all of these people are people who have far more credentials than you and I have, right? It's the difference between a lawyer who went to law school and passed the bar exam and me, who I just have a feeling that you should plead guilty. What's that based on? I don't know. I just feel like you should. You know, and that flies in the face of the lawyer who went to law school and passed the bar association. That flies in the face of his counsel, which is to plead not guilty. But so we have to be honest about these things. So when we're denying what Mark said, we can do that certainly, but we have to understand what we're doing. We're denying somebody with much greater credential to make a claim like that than we will ever have. Now, the question becomes, and you might have already been thinking this, but isn't it like the telephone game? How accurate is the Bible? Like, is what he put down what we're still reading in our Bibles today? Is there a consistency? Is accuracy? Were these things written so long after Jesus that stories have just kind of exaggerated? And so now he's saying that he was the Son of God, but he didn't really originally say that, or we can't know that. So there's all these questions about, okay, we see what he said, we see that it requires faith, but faith isn't blind. We see that he's a real person with great credential, but can we trust what he has written down? And that's exactly what we're going to discuss in the next video. So I can't wait to see it on.